Hi folks, I'm Professor Kelly Kraemer from the Peace Studies Department, and I'm the organizer or instigator or chief mischief maker for this panel, depending on how you regard it. As you can see from the screen, our topic today, is it okay to punch a Nazi? With the real key part being how to make real social change. So we're going to talk about different ways to approach how to respond to hate groups of all different sources. We've got Professor Nickolas Becker from the theology department, and then we have me from the Peace Studies department. And we're all aiming to go short in our talks, so there will be lots of time for question and answers, but I'll be honest, we're also all professors. So some of us may be long-winded.
Let me begin by acknowledging that the question that's posed to us today is a bit tongue-in-cheek, arising from a piece in the New York Times that describes an alt-right leader being punched on the day of the inauguration. The internet exploded in the wake of that event. You'd see some pictures not unlike what's on our screen now of Indiana Jones punching Nazis from the Spielberg films, and the suggestion that this was the level of seriousness with which this question should be addressed. However, I think that the rest of the title of today's panel, How to Make Real Social Change, along with a related notion, how to deal with people whose views we profoundly disagree with, or even find offensive, are topics that are ripe for serious reflection. If I were to straightforwardly answer the question posed, is it okay to punch a Nazi? I would reply that it depends on what the Nazi is doing. To reflect on these matters from a Catholic Benedictine perspective, I want to begin by reflecting on when violence may be appropriate. Then I want to reflect on these questions in the light of the rule of St. Benedict, and I want to conclude with some thoughts about these matters in the light of Catholic social teaching. First, the question of violence. We have seen a disturbing trend of attacks in recent years. Vehicles are now being used as weapons. In Charlottesville on August 12th of this year at 1:42 p.m., a car rammed into a crowd, injuring 19 people and killing one person. The car was driven by a 20-year-old who has been charged with second-degree murder and other crimes. I have great respect for the tradition of Christian pacifism and nonviolence. The American theologian Stanley Hauerwas was very prominent in my doctoral dissertation. But I don't quite walk with them to the extent that I think there are times when violence is morally justified. Within the tradition, ultimately coming from the principles of the just war theory, there is a right to legitimate personal self-defense and defense of those who are unable to defend themselves. If possible, avoid lethal violence, but take steps to stop those who will harm you or others. So in the case of Charlottesville, I would say that the use of violence to stop that car that was plowing through the crowd is morally justified. Perhaps to put my thoughts into the terms of the question posed here, if punching a Nazi is the only way you can defend yourself or others from physical attack, then as a last resort, one may punch a Nazi. But violence, I'm going to say, is always regrettable, and it's not really effective for long-term peace building and social change. Perhaps an insight from the rule, particularly from chapters 23 to 29 and 43 to 46, the so-called penal code of the rule of St. Benedict, might be helpful. These chapters deal with how the abbot and the community deal with problem monks, those monks who violate the rule in some way. Make no mistake, in those chapters of the rule, there is language of discipline and punishment and excommunication, and even of dismissing an unrepentant monk from the monastery. But the tone of these passages is full of compassion for the suffering, presuming that the monk who is acting out is somehow sick and in need of healing. If you look at chapter 27 of the rule, one of the pastoral masterpieces of the rule, you'll see this compassion quite clearly. Well, what does this have to do with punching Nazis or effecting social change? It has become cliché to call for greater civility in public discourse. Perhaps I am simply naive or wildly idealistic, but what we need in public discourse is not civility. We need love. Benedict does not say to yell at the problem monk, but to love the problem monk back to health. The same is true for the person with whom we profoundly disagree. We need to find ways to communicate love, because the human person is so much more than her views or his behavior or even her character. The human person has a worth and a dignity that is inalienable, even when he fails to live up to that dignity. So, in summary, don't punch the Nazi, love the Nazi. That brings me to my third and final point on Catholic social teaching on the dignity of the human person. Certainly it's naive to say that everyone can be loved into morally appropriate views. We live in a polarized society, and there are times when demonstrations and counter-demonstrations will need to be made. A fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching is the dignity of the human person. In the age of social media, disagreement has become meaner. By all means, witness to truth, justice, and charity, but be sure to do that in ways that live up to our human dignity. To communicate without love not only wounds the dignity of our brothers and sisters with whom we are communicating, it wounds our own dignity. To give an example of this, I actually have a graphic or two. Let's see. Perhaps you've heard of the Westboro Baptist Church. Routinely identified as a hate group for LGBT persons, for Catholics, for Orthodox Christians, Muslims, Jews, and American soldiers. Not infrequently, they will picket the funerals of soldiers who've been killed in battle with signs that say horrible things, deeply distressing to the families of the bereaved. People will dress up in angel wings to block their signs from view. I find that to be a beautiful way to demonstrate with clarity, but with gentleness and with real purpose. Another example actually would come from the Charlottesville incidents themselves. Perhaps you saw the picture of Cornel West and the Christian pastors that day lined up arm in arm while there were men, militia groups with machine guns right next to them. I think a beautiful way to respond to violence with something less than violence. Demonstrate, disagree, make your voice heard, but in ways that will elevate the discussion and remind us of the dignity of the human person, not detract from it.
Unlike Professor Becker, I am a pacifist, kind of born that way. So I'll just put that out there so you have that in the back of your minds when you're evaluating what I have to say. And I also wanted to mention that in peace studies we have a particular definition of violence that's a little different from the one we heard from Professor Putnam. So I want you to have this definition of violence in mind as I'm talking and frequently using the word violence. Johann Galtung, who's known as the father of peace studies, defines violence as avoidable harm, particularly to living beings, but you can also think of it as avoidable harm to the planet. So something like eating a potato, while it's causing harm to the potato, in some respects is unavoidable. If you're a Jain, Jain, the religion that some people practice in India and that region. You might go so far as to wear a mask to prevent yourself from accidentally swallowing bugs and sweeping bugs out of your path. You're still going to cause harm even if you're just waiting for the nuts and fruit to fall from the tree. So in peace studies, we define violence as avoidable harm. And I did, when I came up with the title for this panel, and first mentioned it to Mary Geller, Vice President of Student Development at St. Ben's, who was organizing the Charlottesville series, I about thought she was going to have a heart attack. What do you mean, is it okay to punch a Nazi? And that is partly tongue-in-cheek, but it's also something that's being seriously debated on the left these days. Should we meet violence or the potential for violence with violence? How confrontational should we be? And so I wanted to lay that as the background for what I'm about to say. And unlike Dr. Putnam, I can't be brief without a script, so I'm going to read some of this and try and stick to the script. So really complex topic. I'm going to try and speak briefly, a little bit humorously, but also seriously. And finally, it came down to, when figuring out what to say, there's a headline last month on a website called Waging Nonviolence, which gives news from all over the world about resistance movements, nonviolent movements, people trying to do all kinds of things in all kinds of different countries. And the headline caught my eye. It read, "Why Nazis are so afraid of these clowns." And beneath it was an actual picture of dancing clowns, full makeup, crazy hair, big shoes, and the whole thing. Here's one of several stories that was featured in that article, as told by the reporter Sarah Freeman Wolpert. In 2007, the group Anti-Racist Action staged a full-fledged clown performance at a neo-Nazi rally in Knoxville, Tennessee. The clowns feigned confusion at demonstrators' cries of "white power" and called back, "white flour?" as they threw fistfuls of baking flour into the air. "White power," the neo-Nazi group shouted. And the clowns pretended they finally understood their mistake. "Oh, white flowers," they cried out, handing white flowers to passersby, including some of the neo-Nazis themselves. "White power," the Nazis yelled again. "Tight shower?" the clowns called back, holding a shower head in the air and crowding together in a ridiculous attempt to follow the directions of the white supremacist group. And they tried once more, "White power." And the female clowns exclaimed, as though they finally understood, "Wife power," raising letters in the air to spell out the words and hoisting the male clowns in the air, running around and carrying them in their arms. As you can imagine, the clowns completely stole the show and continued parading through the streets with the police smiling happily at their sides, while the neo-Nazi group called off their demonstration several hours early. The story grabbed and held my attention because of its sharp contrast with so much of what I was seeing in my social media newsfeed and on the television news, which are filled daily with passionate essays about why we need to fight hate with violence. This is a serious debate going on the left. The answer to the shorthand question often posed in these pieces, is it okay to punch a Nazi, mostly seemed to be a resounding yes. But the clowns told a different and really important story. So I'm here today to argue that using violence against hate groups is actually the least effective way to fight them. In fact, it's likely to backfire and cause them to grow. If you want to win against fascists and haters, you need to follow the clowns. Stand up and fight back against Nazis and fascists and the KKK by all means. But do it by using open, humanizing, community-building alternatives that let people see hate for what it is. It's the old principle of show, don't tell. So I'm going to present 3 claims with stories to support this argument. But first, I wanted to take a quick moment to marvel at the fact that Nazi punching has become a thing. And there are lots of people who want to punch Nazis. And just to give you some ideas, if you go on to Etsy or TeePublic, these sites where people can sell homemade things, you can get a Punch More Nazis hoodie, Punch More Nazis buttons, stickers, mugs, caps, pendants, all kinds of things. Right? If you really want to have some fun, There's actually canipunchnazis.com, where you can go and watch Richard Spencer being punched by a masked man, sucker punched, right? The answer on this site, yes, it's always okay to punch a Nazi. If you need more details, they take you to an actual, one of the many op-eds arguing that, yes, we need to use violence to defend people. Let's see if I can do this right. Yes. Okay. You can also find cartoons that demonstrate how some people can hold both these positions at the same time, right? Shelter more refugees, a loving, humane reaching out to our fellow human beings. Punch more Nazis, right? Maybe some of our fellow human beings aren't quite as human or shouldn't be treated as quite as human. But I think what you end up with, if you try and hold these two together, right? Most people read it this way, right? Tolerance, peace, and stop hate, or beating somebody bloody, right? And if you really want to be effective, then you have to get beyond the personal catharsis. For a lot of people, it may feel really good to punch a Nazi. And far be it from me to ever tell my Jewish friends, no, you can't punch a Nazi. My black friends, no, you can't punch KKK. Tell anybody how to defend themselves. But I think there are some things I'd like you to consider that go beyond this in the direction that both of the other panelists have already pointed quite clearly. So the first claim I want to talk about is the idea that violent resistance can keep people from getting hurt. In fact, violent resistance does not keep people from getting hurt. Neither, for that matter, does nonviolent resistance. There's no guarantees. Anti-fascist activist Emily Rose Nauert actually concisely expressed a common claim in support of the beat-up Nazis idea when she said, you actually need violence to protect nonviolence. Now, that goes against everything I've ever learned about nonviolence, right? When a nonviolent movement is trying to achieve its goals, and a group decides to join the nonviolent movement and, bless you, use violence, right? It ruins the dynamic, paints the whole movement as violent, and allows for great repression. Right? Nonetheless, it's important to take this point seriously. It was recently illustrated by Dr. Cornel West and some of the other pastors in Charlottesville, who famously claimed that anti-racist activists saved their lives after the police refused to step in and protect these unarmed religious leaders who were demonstrating. But if you dig a little deeper into these stories, what you find is that the anti-racist activists did step in, some with weapons, but mainly what happened is they took the brunt of the fascist violence on themselves. So they protected others, but they received the violence themselves. So it was just a different set of people that got hurt. And despite the presence of anti-racist activists willing to step in and use violence, Heather Heyer was still killed by that young man driving the car, and 19 other people were injured. Gandhi himself often said it's better to be violent than to be a coward, but better still would be to take action while refusing to do harm, which is his definition of nonviolence. Think about that. Take action while refusing to do harm. Nonviolent resistors go through extensive training to prepare to meet violence without responding with physical force. You don't need weapons to place yourself between those who wield weapons and their intended victims. You can use a technique called nonviolent interposition. Now, once again, there's no guarantee here that you're not going to get hurt or even killed, but I have some images to share. During the Chinese student occupation of Tiananmen Square in 1989, a man who's since become known as Tank Man walked into the streets in front of a line of tanks and for several minutes kept them from advancing. And you can see him. It's a very effective way to prevent a tank from advancing because tanks have a really hard time turning. And so all this one man had to do was walk back and forth in front of the tanks. And the whole line of tanks was stopped. Not permanently, not in the long run. Nobody's sure what happened to Tank Man. But it's a sign of what you can do when you put your body in between the oppressive force and the people it would oppress. During the Egyptian Revolution in 2011, Christians in Tahrir Square formed protective circles around Muslims while they prayed to protect them from the police. In a famous photo from last year, a nurse named Aisha Evans stood quietly in front of Baton Rouge riot police, preventing them from advancing. In fact, look at them. They are literally taken aback. Right? They're moving back on their heels because this one woman is standing quietly in front of them. Right? And then, most recently in 2017, anti-racist marchers in Boston so far outnumbered the so-called alt-right demonstrators that the alt-right rally failed. Most of the people couldn't even get to the meeting place. There were estimates of the crowd being as large as 30,000 people. Right? You can outwit violent demonstrators simply by vastly outnumbering them, and this tells us there are more people against hate than there are for it. Second claim I want to briefly touch on, that violence is not only ineffective against hate groups, it gives them what they want. Organizers of today's alt-right demonstrations target cities where they're likely to encounter armed resistance, armed opposition, Portland, Berkeley, so that they can present themselves as the victims. It's a recruiting tool. This guy named Christian Picciolini, who as a teenager organized the violent racist Chicago area skinheads. And one day, after having a child, losing his girlfriend, starting a business and encountering black customers who were interested in the same music he liked and was trying to sell, had a change of heart. And he's now a founding member of the organization Life After Hate. But he stresses in his memoir, Romantic Violence, that those who join the modern-day KKK, neo-Nazi, and skinhead groups are looking for a sense of belonging. They feed on the identity of being underdogs. Right? Their hate gives them a sense of power, and these hate groups become their family. History professor Laurie Marthofer, who studies German history, points out that the Nazis used the same dynamic in the 1930s. Right? They would go and hold rallies in the places where they expected to be attacked, such as a town called Wedding. They knew if they marched there, it would result in a massive fight, which brought massive media attention, helped the Nazis paint themselves as victims. We were just going to march, and all these people attacked us, and brought more people over to their side. Right? And again, it was people seeking a sense of identity. Imagine putting on the uniform, having a bright red symbol, marching with all those other people, having a charismatic leader. It can be very tempting. So what do we do instead? My third and final claim rests on some pretty solid research, which those of you who've taken my classes have heard about before. Nonviolent resistance succeeds where violent resistance cannot. In an exhaustive comparative study that was published in 2011, researchers Erica Chenoweth and Maria Steffen studied 323 violent and nonviolent movements around the world from 1900 to 2006, and they had which were violent and which were nonviolent vetted by all kinds of scholars because there is no such thing as a pure movement in either direction. And when they crunched the numbers, they found that nonviolent movements were twice as likely to succeed as violent movements. And the key variable was participation. Any movement that attracted the participation of 3.5% or more of the population achieved its goals, even if the goal was overthrowing the government. And the only movements that reached that level of participation were nonviolent movements, unarmed movements. So think about it. When it comes to building participation and resistance, right, and this is why I consider this question about punching Nazis so important, since it's being debated, how are you going to get people to actually go out and resist? Think about this. How many of you are really prepared to go out and meet Nazis in the streets with sticks, bats, knives, maybe even guns? But how many of you would donate money to an involuntary walkathon? It's one of my favorite recently developed nonviolent techniques. Like the folks in Wunsiedel, Germany, who pledged 10 euros for every meter that white supremacists marched in their town, with the funds going to a group dedicated to helping people leave extremist hate groups. They even went out, they marked a starting line in chalk, and then they marked the meters. And they raised something like, I think it was 10,000 euros was the figure I saw. right? How many of you would be willing to cover a street where fascists plan to march with rainbow day-glow paint and glitter that will stick to the bottoms of their shoes and leave footprints all over town? How many of you might join a choir singing songs like You're So Vain or JoJo's Leave, Get Out to drown out racist chants in your town? How many of you would be more inspired by unarmed people placing themselves between the pastors and the neo-Nazis in Charlottesville than by street brawls between the two sides? Okay. Are you really likely to go out and become part of that 3.5% that can change the world if you're going to be asked to beat on someone? Right? Or do you want to dress up like a clown and throw flour and pass out flowers, right? And talk about wife power, right? Why punch a Nazi? I guess my final point is, why punch a Nazi when you can make them look silly instead? It looks like we did our job of keeping, we've got about 35 minutes till our official ending time of 5:45. So if people want to ask questions, I'll bring the mic out into the audience, pass it around.
Kelly, I have a question for you. Why do you say you identify as a pacifist when in our nonviolence class we defined pacifism as different than being a nonviolence?
That's a great question, Kateri. I hate talking at people's backs, so I'm going to run up here. We do define pacifism as different from nonviolence. Pacifism historically has meant opposition to war, and in the broader sense, opposition to the use of violence, all violence to solve conflicts. Nonviolence is a technique of action. So you can use all the nonviolent resistance techniques I was just talking about, and that was a tiny number compared to the hundreds that have been identified. You can use those without being a pacifist. You can think there are times when it's acceptable to use violence in self-defense. You can think that the only way to stop Hitler was to go to war and still use nonviolence. When I say I'm a pacifist, I mean that I think war and violence as a way of solving conflict is always, at best, a failure of human imagination and creativity. Right? We're a species that can invent nuclear weapons. Right? We have the power to destroy life on this planet as we know it. And we can't invent a better way to do our conflicts. So sometimes it may be seen as a last resort. It's because we run out of ideas. And if you look at the budgets we put into finding ways to fight wars versus finding ways to create peace, maybe that'll explain why. So that's what I mean by I'm a pacifist. And then additionally, I also personally would not choose to use violence. We don't need to go further into me because it's not all about me. But who else has a question?
Can you elaborate a little bit more on symbolic violence and any suggestions that you would have in regard to that?
Can I just chip in here with, because I didn't really get into the Gandhian whole side of nonviolence, but Gandhi used to talk about, and this is something where I think movements today are really falling down. He used to talk about the difference between obstructive program and constructive program. An obstructive program is where you're out in the streets trying to stop bad things from happening. Constructive program, this is why the symbol of his movement was the spinning wheel. It means building, it's that be the change you want to see in the world. Building the community that you want to live in and not waiting for somebody else to make it happen. And I think what a lot of movements have fallen into today is something bad happens when we go out and we march back and forth in the street, and maybe we sit in somewhere or we block something. But it's really hard. The movements have gotten pretty bad at conveying what it is we're for versus what we're fighting against, right? And I would add also with the things like ridiculing the Nazis, are you ridiculing the people or the ideas? Right? The flower was not being thrown at them, it was being thrown in the air. And yes, and I mean, it's a thin line, and they're probably going to feel like they are being mocked, right? And that's where you have to keep the other side, the constructive program. How do you build something that's going to get somebody who's part of this Nazi march or this KKK march to come maybe hang out on the fringes of your event. You know, if they're looking for a sense of belonging, can you create somewhere for them to belong? Easier said than done, for sure.
This is a question kind of for all of you. Talking about, I haven't studied just war theory in like 3 years, so I don't necessarily remember all the parts to it, but is there a sense of within like violence versus nonviolence, like when deciding how best to act in a situation of like the urgency and how immediate the effects of one person's violent actions towards another? So in the instance of getting punched in the face by, let's say a Nazi punches someone in the face, do you respond, if you've already chosen to respond in a nonviolent way, then you probably will not. But if you, in that moment, are not sure what the response should be, how can you decide whether to be nonviolent or violent, or in the situation where there's a war or a genocide or something occurring, how do you decide a strategy of nonviolence versus violence? And is there something in just war theory that would explain kind of that that issue of how quickly a response needs to happen?
Well, I can try. I guess I would just say that I reached to just war theory to talk about personal defense as opposed to kind of the larger precepts of just war theory. And particularly in questions like this, I'm really concerned about cars being used as weapons and these sorts of techniques where mortal danger is being inflicted on people who don't have the luxury of time to deliberate as to kind of what's the most appropriate way to respond. So I say it regretfully because I think violence is a tragedy, but in instances like that, where there is mortal danger to people, it's not just an insult punch, if you will, but people's lives are at danger. And the only way that someone can be stopped is by taking violence, and if necessary, lethal violence. I see that as tolerable.
Yeah. One of the things people in nonviolent movements do that's essential, and if you skip it, you're going to run into problems, training beforehand. The civil rights movement, they were masters at this. There's a terrific video, part of the Force More Powerful series that I would encourage people to watch. It's on the Nashville student sit-in meeting. And they trained, you know, they did simulations. Okay, you're going to sit in. We've got a counter here. We've got some stools. Come sit on the stools. And you folks are going to play the white folks, and you folks are going to be the sit-in folks. And as they're sitting in, part of the simulation, they're actually like tapping cigarette ash onto people's heads and wrestling them off the stools. And they stopped short of actually hurting each other, but they made the scenarios as realistic as possible. There are also things you can teach people about nonviolent defense, like, okay, you're probably taller than I am. Do you mind being used for a demonstration? Yeah, stand up, please. I won't go through the whole thing, but I used to do nonviolence training. One of the things you do if somebody's bigger than you, and it looks like they're going to try and take a swing, or they're coming bear hug, right? Since I don't know you, I won't do it full on because it might make you uncomfortable. But you can pin somebody's arms, and if you can actually link your hands back, it's hard for them to break out of it. And it's a strange dynamic. They get uncomfortable with the intimacy, and first reaction is likely to be you want to back away. Now, again, as I said, there's no guarantee that you're not going to get hurt. But I would not encourage anybody to wait till the last minute to decide how you're going to handle a situation like that. The sooner, I don't need to go on. That's enough.
Well, first I'd like to thank you all three for sharing your knowledge and for helping students make sense of everything that's going also through an academic lens. My question's still percolating in my mind, but I went to a conference this Saturday, and it was about the sustainability movement, and someone said that they never worried about people that didn't agree with their idea. They only focused on people that agreed with their idea because they had enough people, and that was a lot stronger and a better use of their time. And that made me think a lot different about movements. And at the same time, we're saying that nonviolence is the best thing because if we are violent, we're giving the Nazis exactly what they're asking for. And since November, since Trump, I've been on the streets a lot. And I guess my question is, how effective are these going into the streets and counteracting the Nazis in the first place, if it is the most effective, or if it is kind of spurring the anti-movements, spurring the Nazi movements, because there's people in the streets in the first place, so therefore there needs to be a counter-movement. And if a more effective strategy would be for the left not to go into the streets in the first place, but to use other strategies. And I'm just pondering this because I totally believe in movements and see its effectiveness, and I'm a peace studies major, but as we're talking about those individual going to the church or going to these places, my question is just for all three of you, what is the most effective things for people on the left to do, and if going onto the streets is kind of spurring the hate in another way?
Peace studies solution is always both and rather than either or. Right? And one of the things to keep in mind is different people will be willing and able to do different things. And if you try and do it all, you may neglect self-care and burn yourself out in serious ways. So some of it is thinking about what you know how to do, where you can best contribute. And some of it is what is motivating you. I saw some other hands up here.
So if you look at the last, let's say, 17 years, and you look at the history of peaceful protest in the United States, from, like, I guess, Iraq to Occupy to the recent protests that have happened pre and post-election, and if these have been so successful, and if we look at, you know, the majority of peaceful protests being so change-making and good for our country, look at where it's gotten us. We have an insanely right-wing government and a president that gets more mad at football players than neo-Nazis. So this collective, this right-wing collective, has kind of consolidated power over the last 17 years, and this power is sympathetic to neo-Nazis, to say the least. And now what we're seeing with Charlottesville, and I think other places recently in Pittsburgh, this gentleman wearing a swastika armband got punched out because of organizing, and they found him and did it. But I wonder, to what extent, considering the extent that the frame has already been shifted to the right into nationalism, into Nazism, to what extent is wearing a Nazi armband in public continuing to shift the discourse to the right, to shift the discourse to what is acceptable to do in our country? Because I know I don't want to live in a country where you can wear a Nazi swastika armband in public. I don't think that's an idea that we should entertain. And I think that idea is explicitly linked to the person doing it. I mean, you don't do that kind of thing unless you believe it and you want to follow through on these ideas. So I just wonder, where are we going, and what does this shift represent, especially with the last 17 years of successful, peaceful protests?
I don't know if I'd say the last 17 years have exemplified successful, peaceful protest in our country. Yeah, okay, we got millions of people out to demonstrate against the Iraq War. It was 10 to 15 million around the world. And President Bush set up, it's a focus group. Then he went ahead and went to war. It's the largest anti-war demonstration in history, but it didn't stop the war. So that's a smaller piece. With regard to your larger question, I don't think you're going to get people to stop wearing Nazi armbands by going and beating them up. Maybe that one guy might feel threatened, might decide not to do it for a while, but 10 more guys are going to say, oh, we have the right to free speech in this country. He was just expressing his opinion. White people really are under attack. If we have opinions that support pride in our own race, then you're going to build it up. So I think part of my answer to your question would come back to this issue where I think the movements have been weak, the constructive program, building alternative institutions. The right has been really strong at that. to the point where you can look at their presence in the current presidential administration. And the left is kind of, oh, we're too cool for school. We're anarchists, so I'm being a little cynical here. But the left has spent a lot of time trying to find the perfect way to be and the perfect organization and the perfect ideology. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody, but not so much time putting the time and energy into building the things we want to see. A lot of my energy these days is leaning more in the direction of what can I do to, I'm going to be a customer at the co-ops and less of a customer of corporations, right? I'm going to work with local organizations rather than worrying about marching on DC. Trying to, this is kind of a not very well thought out answer, but how do you build the connections that bring people together instead of forcing them apart? And I'm trying to see if there's anybody here from political science who could talk about it from the organizing in the political institutional way. My thing is not, I think that stuff is going to happen at the grassroots. And I think that's where we've been weaker in our organizing. It's not enough just to go out and say, why didn't we stop the Iraq War from happening? Well, because we were able to get millions of people out in the streets saying, no, we don't want it to happen. But the next day when President Bush said, oh, that's just a focus group, we didn't have another million ready to go occupy the White House and Capitol Hill and block the streets and make business undoable until they took us seriously. And we didn't have, we did have people explaining why the reasons that were given for the war weren't actually true. But we didn't have a media that could get that out to the people who didn't know it and weren't watching Democracy Now. Well, we didn't. Anyway, is that making sense? That's off the cut. Anybody else want to add? Just that, as far as squashing Nazism, we had World War II that was supposed to put an end to it, and it didn't put an end to it. Nazism, racism, fascism, terrorism, all of these things, when we try to fight them physically, we're not going to defeat them because they are not physical, material things. They're ideas. So how do you squash the ideas? Right? In Germany, you're not allowed to wear the swastika. It's against the law. You put people in jail for it. But for some folks, that just then encourages the idea that our freedoms are being suppressed, and now they've got a right-wing movement moving back into politics successfully. I don't want to lightly dismiss the tens of millions that were lives that were lost in World War II. But that suggests to me that massive violence isn't going to stop this. So we gotta look for the deeper ways to reconnect. In peace studies, we often talk about the difference between dominance and mutuality. How do we create a world of mutuality where we're respecting the dignity of all human persons, as we would say in Catholic social teaching, rather than a world where it's dominate or be dominated? And actually convincing people that those are choices rather than just human nature. But Brandon, you have a question?
That actually, in some ways, leads to the question that I have on my mind. Thinking about how when you define something, you get to tell its story. And if we say someone is a Nazi or fill in the blank of any other thing that we contextually think is bad, who gets to define what a Nazi is, figuratively? And do we not find ourselves in a position where if at any point in time we disagree with you or your ideology or philosophy, whatever the lingo of the moment is, you will be labeled as that, and we get to punch a Nazi. So my question, I guess, is perhaps problematic only for the context of these places. Who are our figurative or metaphorical Nazis here, and who's defining them, and why, and how does that give us pause to figure out what's next?
No, In terms of who names Nazis, I find that neo-Nazis tend to identify themselves. I think while I do appreciate that ideas do take material form, I think to personalize these things can be very difficult. That I think it's much better to debate ideas than it is to go after people.
Well, folks, it looks like we've reached 5:45, so our time is officially up. If anybody has further questions, I'm sure some of us can stick around a little and talk a little more. Otherwise, thank you very much for coming and hearing us out and having such great questions and great dialogue.